Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and members of the research group Democratic Vistas, dear participants in our video-based panel discussion on multilateralism, Atlantic democracies, and global order. My name is Matthias Lutz-Bachmann. I'm professor at Frankfurt University and director of the Forschungskolleg Humanwissenschaften, an institute which is working as an institute for advanced studies of our university, Goethe University in Frankfurt, Germany. I'm very proud to welcome you all for our afternoon discussion, or depending on where you are, morning discussion for all who are participating in the American continent. I'm very happy to welcome especially our guests, Professor Anne-Marie Slaughter, who will join us in these minutes. She is a professor emerita of politics on international affairs at Princeton University and CEO of the think tank New America, the Canadian ambassador to Germany and former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Canada, Dr. Stéphane Dion, as well as my dear colleague, Professor Gunther Hellmann, is Professor of Political Science at Goethe University and the moderator of our panel discussion today. Our research institution, Forschungskolleg Humanwissenschaften, recently started and launched its research group called Democratic Vistas, Reflections on the Atlantic World. This group of researchers is focused on a very important subject. The subject not only of European-American relations, including Canada, the US, and other parts of America, but we are focusing especially on the relations in politics and culture, with a special interest in the questions of democratic structures in not only the single countries, but in the international relation, so to speak, international relations on democratic principles. That means on the basic rights and the question of societal justice. Today, we are holding our second international, and that means transatlantic conference. And I'm very proud that our two directors of the program, Johannes Voelz and Gunther Hellmann, are with us. And I would like now ask Gunther to introduce our speakers to the participants. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Lutz-Bachmann, and thank you everybody who is willing, ready to join us today for this session. We are still trying to work out whether Professor Slaughter can join us, and we're not sure why that is not yet the case. But for the time being, we thought that we maybe just get started with Ambassador Stéphane Dion, who is already in the room. And in order to just briefly introduce him, let me just summarize the main points of his CV before we get started. Ambassador Dion has been ambassador to Germany since June 2017, but he is also the Prime Minister's special envoy to the European Union and to Europe as a whole. He has been, prior to his appointment, among others, Minister of Foreign Affairs from November 2015 until January 2017, and what might become also significant today in our discussion, among others, Minister of the Environment from 2004 and 2005, during which time he chaired the United Nations Conference on Climate Change. As you all know, one of the most challenging multilateral tasks in the context of the Kyoto Protocol and its aftermaths. Among others, Stéphane Dion is also, which is a nice coincidence for us at the Forschungskolleg, a professor of political science. He has taught at the Université de Menton in 1984 and from 1984 until 1995 at the Université de Montréal. So we are joined here today by one of those rare creatures, if I may say so, Ambassador, someone who is a practitioner but also a scientist, and that is precisely the kind of expertise that we appreciate in the context of our new research project, Democratic Vistas. I will, as for the time being, until Professor Slaughter might be able to join us, just defer in terms of introducing her, and would suggest that you, Ambassador Dion, just start with your presentation that you have prepared. Thanks again for joining us, and we're looking forward to the discussion with you.
Dankeschön, Professor Hellmann. Dear Professor Slaughter, she's with us. I hope she will be with us pretty soon. Esteemed colleagues, meine Damen und Herren, Mesdames et Messieurs, I will argue that the fundamental trend in multilateralism, which is our topic today, multilateralism, the fundamental trend in multilateralism today is the growing tension between what I will call the universalist conception, which makes multilateralism an instrument for the promotion of universal rights, and the Westphalian conception, which makes multilateralism the instrument of cooperation between different political regimes. So I am honored to make these remarks at the invitation of Goethe Universität, alongside a professor as renowned as Anne-Marie Slaughter, Herr Professor Hellmann, lieber Günther, nochmals vielen Dank für diese wunderbare Gelegenheit. Multilateralism, a short definition. Multilateralism is cooperation among states in accordance with international standards. These international standards are codified in legal documents, charters, agreements, treaties, and so on, and institutionalized through a wide range of international organizations with the United Nations at the center. Every year, new standards, new organizations, new forums, new agreements are added, to the point one may say that today multilateralism covers all areas of human activity. And the latest development, as you know, on July 1st, 130 countries, including all G20 countries, reached an agreement on a global minimum effective tax rate of 15%. So that's multilateralism in constant expansion. This system, multilateralism, is a difficult one, since it seeks to establish conformity with international standards in a system that remains fundamentally based on the sovereignty of states. So to varying degrees, states have always been inclined to follow the international rules that benefit them while ignoring or bending, let's say, bending the rules they do not like. Through the search for cooperation between sovereign states, the two conceptions I mentioned of multilateralism were opposed from the start. The Westphalian, where states cooperate without interfering in each other's internal affairs, and the Universalist, which places multilateralism at the service of the promotion of democracy and universal rights. The Westphalian conception of multilateralism found its formulation in principle number 7 in the 1945 United Nations Charter, which states, and I quote, "Nothing contained in the present charter shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state," end of quote. The universalist conception of multilateralism has been strongly affirmed at the outset by the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which specify the universal rights related to the dignity of each human being. And this universalist conception of multilateralism insists on the truly universal nature of these rights. No human being should be deprived of these rights in the name of cultural relativism or the sovereignty of states. For universalists, the principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries should be regulated by international law and ultimately by the responsibility to protect populations from human rights violation in any country. And with Professor Slaughter, we have an expert of this doctrine of the responsibility to protect. The rivalry between the Westphalian and universalist conceptions of multilateralism continued throughout the Cold War and the post-Cold War periods, in a context of tension between great powers, each great power wanting to prevent the others from using multilateral institutions to extend their areas of influence. However, my point, for the time being, there are two diverging trends now in the current global order, which will make the adjustment of Westphalian and universalist conceptions of multilateralism particularly problematic for us. On the one hand, the interdependence of democratic and certain authoritarian regimes has increased. On the other hand, the abuses of authoritarian regimes have become, through new media, more visible and known, and are therefore all the less tolerated by democratic public opinions. So more interdependency and more rejections of authoritarian practices. Nowhere is this tension between Westphalianism and universalism more evident than in the relationship of democracies with China. China, an unprecedented kind of authoritarian superpower, in that it combines a dazzling race in both economic and military power. The USSR, partly on its own volition, was not strongly integrated into the world economic system, but China is. China is already the top exporter and the leader in industrial production, and by far the biggest lender in the world. For 64 countries, China is the largest merchandise trading partner, while for 38 countries, it is the United States. For the first time, the United States and other democracies are in military and ideological rivalry with an authoritarian regime with which they trade more and have intense exchanges in all fields. This exposes democracies to contradictory tendencies towards China, which they see at the same time as a partner, a competitor, and a totalitarian regime. Suddenly, democracies sanction China more and more, with whom they trade more and more. At the same time, the populations of democratic states are more directly exposed, notably through new information channels, to the horrors of the world, massacres, repression, and other atrocities. Our people react very badly to these injustices and demand that their governments put pressure on these oppressive regimes, including through trade and personal sanctions, which are not always an effective way to promote universal values. The consequence is that democratic states increasingly emphasize the universalist conception of multilateralism, while authoritarian regimes, China and Russia being particularly virulent, of course reject this approach to human rights, which they denounce as Westernization under the guise of universalism. They officially stick to a Westphalian conception of multilateralism. Obviously, both sides continue to accuse the others under cover of these conceptions of multilateralism of interfering in the affairs of other countries to promote their interests. We are therefore in a context where the clash between the Universalist and Westphalian conception of multilateralism is particularly exacerbated. For democracies, this will mean never losing sight of the fact that multilateralism is both promoting universal values and negotiating cooperation with regimes we dislike. Indeed, none of the current global issues can be effectively tackled by the club of democratic states alone. This includes preventing epidemics and better containing them when they occur, taking action against the terrible impact of climate change and the collapse of biodiversity, feeding what will soon be 9 billion human beings without exhausting our ecosystems, ensuring that access to fresh water does not become a source of conflict, not reigniting the Cold War and the nuclear arms race, protecting populations from international terrorism and cyber attacks, halting large-scale tax avoidance, reducing wealth inequalities between and within countries, and humanly managing migration flows and addressing their causes. These are global issues, and they require substantial cooperation between all states, to find solutions supported by effective multilateral organizations. In such a context, it is important that democracies work very closely together, both to support each other and to develop a more cohesive approach in their relationship with authoritarian regimes. A concrete suggestion would be, for example, for well-established democracies like Germany and Canada, to better coordinate their support for fragile democracies or strategically placed democracies in regions of geopolitical interest. Thus, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Canada, the Honorable Marc Garneau, has just asked me, as Special Envoy of Prime Minister Trudeau to Europe, to study how Canada, along with other democratic states like Germany, could better support Armenians in their efforts to improve their democracy. I admit that I am enthusiastic about this mission in Armenia, which seems to me to be a good example of what democracies must do in the current context. To conclude, we will need to find a way to solve global problems by cooperating with regimes we disapprove of, while striving to extend universal rights to all humans. For this challenge of our time, this tension between two conceptions of multilateralism, how to solve that? Well, one will always can count on Canada, always. And I thank Goethe Universität for giving me the opportunity to say so. Thank you very much. Dankeschön. Merci du fond du cœur.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Dion, for these really provoking thoughts that you shared with us. I have been trying to get a sense of whether we have been joined by Professor Slaughter, but if I do not get other signals from my directors in the background, I'm afraid that we have failed to contact her. This is, of course, unfortunate because as of today, Professor Slaughter had even retweeted our announcement that we will meet today. We are somehow at a loss why she cannot make it, because we have sent everything to her. Frau Kuban, may I just briefly ask you? No luck. Well, I think we tried to get in touch with her team via phone, via different phone numbers, but have not been lucky. Well, let us, Ambassador Dion, maybe let us just start with the discussion among the two of us and the plenary here, because you have given us enough food for thought. I know that you and your team had been in touch with Professor Slaughter as well. You have been reading at least one of her articles that was part of the reading for today. And I think there are a few themes that the two of you, in my understanding of your writing and publications, see in a similar fashion. I found it quite interesting that you, in a sense, developed two notions of a multilateral conception: the universalist and the Westphalian notion. And I was wondering, when you quite convincingly, from my sense, developed that kind of distinction, whether one would not argue that in the end the Westphalians are in a stronger hand, because they can deny the kind of agreements that universalists, the way that you sketch them, are aiming for, in their insistence on old Westphalian kind of standards. What we hear from Russian colleagues, Chinese colleagues, is always United Nations, inclusive multilateralism of that particular sort. Would you agree or disagree with that view, that we as universalists would be in a weaker position structurally because the Westphalian or state-centric kind of conception of multilateralism in the end has the stronger hand?
What I think is, we have been too optimistic at the end of the Cold War, and when the German wall fell down. We thought that democracy would become universal. So this is one of the reasons why the universalist conception is so strong among us, is that we were anticipating that other countries would become democratic, and once they become democratic, they would stay democratic. And in fact, the competition of authoritarianism will remain very strong and for the decades to come. So we are in a situation where it's difficult for us to admit that, but it's the case. And I think we'll need to find a way to adjust our universalist ambitions and the obligation to negotiate with these authoritarian regimes that we dislike. I came with a list of global challenges that we have to face. None of them may be solved only between Germany, Denmark, and Canada and the US. We need also to engage regimes that are in the gray zone or clearly in the authoritarian domain. And the difficulty we have also is that we are more aware, and our populations are much more aware of the exactions, the violations that these regimes are imposing within their own countries. And our populations react very badly to that and are insisting that our governments, and not only governments, I think Professor Slaughter was ready to explain that it's not only a matter between governments, it's also a matter between business communities and the civil rights organizations that are reacting this way. So, for example, in Germany recently, a couple of weeks ago, the Bundestag voted a new law that will require your business communities, your business companies, to respect the law of Germany, even when they are abroad. That means that they will have to be very careful with whom they will partner around the world in order to be sure that there is no situations where workers' rights will not be respected, children's rights will not be respected, that a community will not be polluted forever. So all these obligations to respect human rights is a new request we are imposing to our companies in Germany, in Canada. So what Canada thinks is that we need to cooperate and to coordinate our relationship between democratic countries to be sure that the level playing field will not be at the advantage of authoritarian regimes, because we're imposing to our business these new requirements. This will require a lot of coordination between countries and between democracies, because our populations will not accept that we continue to do business without taking into account what is happening in China and elsewhere.
Well, I've just been told that Professor Slaughter has joined us. Professor Slaughter, can I maybe just see you on the screen? Well, hello. Good morning to you in the US, and welcome to our session here. We started a bit later, but Ambassador Dion has already given a short presentation. I mean, I'm not trying to summarize what he has said, but in essence, I think one of the key theses was that he tried to develop a distinction between two kinds of competing multilateralisms, a universalist conception that is more supported by the kinds of democracies that we are talking about in an Atlantic context, and a Westphalian state-centric conception, more in line with the kinds of practices that we see in Chinese and Russian foreign policy. I think the two of you have, your teams have been in touch, so you might be aware of some of the points that Ambassador Dion has been making in some of his writings. We have distributed some of your publications recently, and if you are ready, we could just give you the screen for your input so that we can then open the discussion with the Ambassador Dion, you and the other audience.
Wonderful. I'd be delighted to do that, and I'm honored actually to be on with Professor Dion, Ambassador Dion, multiple roles, exactly as I think academics should be. I think the idea of different ways of thinking about multilateralism is very important, and I think that Ambassador Dion and I have a similar broad view of multilateralism. My understanding of that as a universalist view, it is universalist, but I think I distinguish more between a statist view of multilateralism and a global view of multilateralism. I think he and I agree that 21st century multilateralism has to move well beyond the Westphalian system. And it's interesting actually that during the Trump administration, Trump, and I would say Putin, President Xi's a little more nuanced and hard to type, but certainly Putin, Trump, and a number of other populist leaders wanted really a return to the pure Westphalian system. They would have gone back to the concert of Europe, except it wouldn't be the concert of Europe today, but a concert of great powers without any institutional constraints. 20th century multilateralism obviously is committed to institutions, but it is still intensively state-based. I started my career as an international lawyer. Only states exist under international law. Obviously, that has evolved, and we have non-state observers, and we have things, NGOs and non-party stakeholders in the Paris Agreement. So there's a limited recognition of what we always call non-state actors, which itself says states are the primary actors and everybody else is non-state. I actually think the 21st century has to make the move from state actors to global actors, and global actors disaggregate states. So you are, of course, talking about important government actors, but you might be talking about their environment ministers or finance ministers as much as you're talking about their foreign ministers or heads of state, much as the EU disaggregates states into networks of ministers. And you're also talking about mayors and governors and legislators. So you're talking about many different government actors, and they are working side by side with corporate actors, civic actors, universities, faith groups, the richness of our societies and our economies. What does that look like in practice? And what does that look like for democracies? And I will try to sketch that here, and then we can open it up. So I think you actually do start with the existing multilateral system, and the Secretary General has very helpfully introduced the idea of networked multilateralism, although I'm not sure that my understanding of that is the same as his, but I think he's at least receptive. So I think you then start by saying you take all those institutions of the 20th century and you disaggregate them and focus less on just straight power, like the Security Council, and more on the issue, the global problems. So take the MDGs, and the many sub areas of the MDGs, and say, look, these issues are what the peoples of the world, the peoples who came together to create the United Nations, need us to be able to solve at the global level. All the different MDGs, from climate to labor to equality to racial equity, to obviously to the more traditional development issues of water security, food security, health, and the environment. Then you disaggregate those institutions into their component parts where they focus on specific problems. So you take the High Commissioner for Refugees, you take the World Health Organization, you take different parts of the economic organizations, and you then make those parts the hub of a wider network or a wider web of global actors. So let me give you a very concrete example. The Global Alliance for Vaccines, Gavi, which was originally the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, is an impact hub for vaccines and immunization. It was actually triggered or initiated by the Gates Foundation, but of course you have the World Health Organization there. You have lots and lots of civic organizations that deliver the vaccines, pharmaceutical companies that produce the vaccines, and national governments. So you have a real mix, but the point is, it is a hub of all the activity and a tremendous amount of the money that goes into vaccinating initially children, but now, of course, under COVID, it spins off COVAX and vaccines more broadly. You can imagine that kind of a hub bringing together those actors in virtually any area. What does that have to do with democracy? That is a vision of open government and open society. Open government in the sense of much more transparent government, but also government that, again, is disaggregated. You don't see a black box. You don't see France or Russia. You see the actual government actors. And again, often, particularly in climate change, those are mayors and governors. In the United States, the mayors and governors of key states have been more important than the federal government. So you can actually see the inner workings of government. You can see how citizens hold government to account, and you see open society, all the room for civil society and commercial entities, and again, all the sort of groups that we think of in education or religion or other sectors of our society coming together and playing an important role alongside government. And those actors, of course, are subject to government because government regulates them, but government is also subject to them because they are the voters and they are the powerful organizations in societies. This is, I mean, if you think about the open government partnership, it talks exactly about open government and open society. It talks about the values of transparency and participation and accountability. To my mind, that is a much better way to push democratic values than talking about a group of democracies, a club of democracies, taking the transatlantic nations and making that the sort of core, and then branching out from that. For one thing, that is very hard on Asian democracies who always feel that they're on the periphery. But more importantly, I think for this generation, talk of the free world, talk of winning the 21st century, talk of, it's democracy versus autocracy, that is not what resonates. That's 20th century multilateralism and 20th century politics. This is a century of global politics. I still deeply believe that the transatlantic nations are absolutely vital, but I think we can talk about the kind of multilateralism we engage in. And again, I'm always for children, but somebody needs to mute. To focus, and what I started to say is the EU, again, is very important here because it does have so many network structures that you can build on. And the transatlantic relationships are often deeply networked, right? We have transatlantic networks of all different kinds, both civic, corporate, and public. But that this is a vision of multilateralism as a place for global actors solving public problems that is deeply supported by and effective when practiced by countries with open governments and open societies. And that, I think, is a way that you can advance multilateralism, make it far more effective, still ultimately promote the values of democracy without dividing the world. So I think I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much. This is indeed food for thought. And since Ambassador Dion was focusing a bit more on the state side of things in a universalist versus Westphalian kind of distinction, I think we might even have some room for a bit of debate here among the two of you who do obviously agree on a lot. Let me, Professor Slaughter, I will put in your CVs, since I briefly introduced Ambassador Dion beforehand. I will put in your CVs into the chat, so I will let people in the room know that the two of you are in some way also similar, since the two of you have professorial careers behind you, but you also are both experienced practitioners in your time as the first female head of the planning staff in the Obama administration with Foreign State Secretary Clinton. So there's a lot of expertise here, both from the academic side and the practical side. Let me just put the point that Professor Slaughter just made to both of you. If I understood you correctly, and that is also an argument that you developed in the piece in Foreign Affairs with your co-author, where you argue that we must not limit the liberal order to the state level, but have to extend it, as you put it, deeper into liberal societies. And the way that you just elaborated is, I take it to mean that it does indeed work on this notion of hubs where civil society is included. What I was wondering, given the Gavi example that you used, to what extent the success of such network multilateralisms depend on rich people like the Gates Foundation and others, or to what extent different segments of civil society might become initiators and leaders also in the kinds of hubs that you have in mind. And since Ambassador Dion did not have a chance yet to join that kind of a part of the discussion, maybe you, Ambassador Dion, could also just have the opportunity to briefly state your views as to what Professor Slaughter has explained to us. Perhaps first to you, Ambassador Dion, and then to Professor Slaughter.
I applaud what Professor Slaughter said, but I think that the trends I mentioned in my remarks will make it difficult to repeat. I see two diverging trends today that stress the difficulty to adjust the Westphalian approach of multilateralism and the universalist one. The first trend I mentioned is that we are more and more, we democracies, in interdependence with some of these authoritarian regimes, especially China. I mean, the relationship we have with China has nothing to do with the one we had with the USSR in the past. So for all our global challenges, we need to sit with China. The other trend is that we are allergic more and more to the abuses that these regimes impose in their own country, to their own populations. But these regimes do not accept that we discuss the way they govern their populations. They react very badly. And concretely speaking, what makes it difficult for developing the approach that Professor Slaughter mentioned is that for now, our main reaction to this difficulty to adjust these two conceptions of multilateralism is a spiral of sanctions. If you take the last example we have in mind, it is the investment agreement between China and the EU that has been negotiated at the end of the chairmanship of the German government. It was a legacy of Chancellor Merkel. The business community of the EU, and especially the one of Germany, was pleased by this agreement, not because it was perfect, but it was in their mind a step in the right direction to discipline China in the EU market and to open more the Chinese market. What happened is that the EU Parliament had to ratify this agreement, started to criticize the awful things that are happening in China, in Hong Kong, and the forced labor and so on, and imposed sanctions to China. China reacted in imposing sanctions, and especially to some EU parliamentarians. And then the EU Parliament said, we cannot ratify this agreement. So the agreement is on hold, maybe forever, because I don't see which one of the two, the EU and China, will withdraw their sanctions. So my suggestion is, okay, sanctions, I understand we need to do that, but it's unlikely to be very effective. It has been effective in South Africa. It was a small country. It was partly a democracy, and we wanted it to be a democracy for all and not a democracy for some. So it worked. At the end of the Cold War, the US were not willing to support the apartheid in South Africa anymore. So the timing was good. But to think that sanctions will change China, it's a big bet. I have some doubt. So what I think we should do, democracies, is to develop much more our ability to regulate. Let's say, for example, good behavior in business, what I mentioned in my presentation. If we're able to harmonize the obligation for the business communities of Germany, Canada, US, and so on, to not accept forced labor, to not use children, to not pollute the areas where they are involved, to coordinate that through the OECD, for example, that's a way to put pressure on China that I think will be more helpful concretely than this spiral of sanctions.
Professor Slaughter, please.
So I agree with that. And indeed, that is very consistent with my argument for disaggregating, that rather than assuming the EU puts sanctions on China and China puts sanctions on the EU, you try to focus much more. It's closer to smart sanctions, but even there, it's not sanctions so much as recognizing interdependence and then tightening, yes, standards and other simply criteria for doing business, which in a way it has been the EU method, right? The Brussels effect is effectively, as Anu Bradford's book, the EU sort of has standards that everybody who wants to sell into the EU has to follow, and increasingly that means it affects labor conditions and other and environmental conditions around the world. So I wouldn't disagree with that. I think the larger question of can you advance this vision of multilateralism that I'm advocating at the same time as having this interdependent, highly conflictual set of relationships among the great powers? I think you can. I'm saying you do it with the old system in place, so you're not tearing it down, and a certain amount of the politics will go on, as always goes on, but at least all the democracies really have to prove to our people that the international system is relevant to them, is relevant to their lives, can make a difference in their lives, whether that is around labor, and of course we're seeing a real train wreck when it comes to trade, because the United States is adopting an industrial policy, and the EU has always had an industrial policy. But for the US, which has been the champion of free trade, we're doing things that is torpedoing our own vision of what the multilateral system should be, which affirms a view domestically that the WTO is bad, right? That it is not only not helping, it's hurting. But similarly, the WHO did not cover itself with glory on the pandemic and on a range of issues that really matter to Americans or to any of our countries. We have to prove that there is a set of global institutions that really can make a difference. And I think, again, we can do that by not looking at the UN as a whole, or the World Bank or the IMF or any of these organizations as a whole, but really engaging, again, mayors, governors, civic groups, corporations are very important here to say, here's the issue and here's what this organization is doing. But which takes me to Professor Hellmann's question on, well, wait a minute, but sure, Gavi was the Gates Foundation, the multi-billionaires, and how is that legitimate? So part of it, I would say, the legitimacy is in its output legitimacy, not input legitimacy. I do think, however, it is important to stay connected to the international system to the extent you can, because for all the problems that the UN has or the WHO has, it has more global legitimacy than the Gates Foundation. But the other point is, I don't think that this takes only really wealthy American or other foundations. Quite the contrary, particularly now that you have trillions in impact capital looking for investments. You can take a particular area, let's just talk about food security. Think about all the companies that impact investors are investing in that have different agricultural practices that are improving food yields and sustainability. Putting those together with the many NGOs, but also again with more local governments and mayors in a way that, and of course you would certainly work with the World Food Organization. I don't think that requires a foundation so much as it requires a willingness to allow this kind of a hub to be created. And it does take, so it takes an engine. It takes somebody's got to decide they really want this. It takes the ability to fund a secretariat, and in that sense, Gates was critical to Gavi. And it takes a willingness of a lot of different actors to say this is where we're getting results and have very clear metrics of success.
Well, thank you very much. I have one question from the chat, and maybe I can use that stage then to open up to whoever would like to join our discussion here. If you want to join the discussion with a question, please use either the chat or raise your hand. At the bottom of the Zoom screen, you probably by now know how to handle that. Just raising your hand puts you in front of my screen here. But the first question came from Nancy Alachem, who is asking, can we imagine a multipolar world without the nation state, or is it a model essential for the 21st century? And maybe if I can just add to that, because I think it links up to both of your statements. Couldn't one also think of a certain type of states, more the smaller kinds of states, the states that depend on multilateralism? Ambassador Dion was making a strong case for Canada's role in that regard. We just had a German white paper on multilateralism was published a few weeks ago, and the English version, I will put it in the chat later on, was just published yesterday. So would that be combined, perhaps your vision, Professor Slaughter, of these hubs that are driven by civil society actors, possibly with the support, not of the great powers, who are the Westphalians in Ambassador Dion's vocabulary, but of the smaller states, or the states that see multilateralism as part of their genes, so to say. So combining that question by Nancy Alachem, perhaps with that kind of dimension, who would like to go in tackling that kind of issue? Ambassador Dion?
Just to say that I cannot imagine the world without the United States, if it's the question. especially now that we have a president willing to work, because President Trump's originality was that he was openly hostile to multilateralism. It did not stop the US to be a partner with us for the reasons Professor Slaughter mentioned, that when you are at a COP, the United Nations Conference on Climate Change, the United States are all over the place, even though President Trump wanted to pull out of Paris. You have the business people, the academia, the journalists, the states, and the congressmen. All of them were there. So no, we need the United States big time. And I hope that the window of opportunity we have now, with the president willing to act and the Congress not in a situation to stop him, we'll enjoy the situation for more than a year and a half. That's my hope.
So I do have a different view there. One, I mean, obviously, I do think the world is better off when the United States is engaged and wants to be fully committed to the multilateral system. Unquestionably. I do think, though, even before Trump, Obama was responding to a very strong sense domestically that we needed to be focusing more on our problems at home rather than abroad, and we have many problems at home, and that we shouldn't be the world's policeman. We were never the world's policeman. It's overplayed, but we certainly had the view that, any big problem, the United States has to be at the table. I do actually think smaller states have a tremendous role to play, as they have before. In the 1990s, the International Criminal Court, the Mines Treaty, there were a number of big international outcomes that were driven by smaller states. And Jared Cohen and Richard Fontaine have an excellent piece in Foreign Affairs on mini-lateralism, where they're talking exactly about smaller states driving these outcomes. I don't think of Germany as a small state. I'm half Belgian, so Belgium is a small state. But regardless, Canada for certain has always played a great role. And if let's say Germany and and Canada and Kenya and Argentina, and it's smaller states still, like states like Costa Rica on environmental issues are very important. I think that can be a very, very fruitful partnership. On the overall, I don't see the nation state disappearing. Maybe it's a failure of imagination, but I remember back in the 90s, everybody was talking about the new medievalism and the end of the sovereign state. I wouldn't say that by the end of the century. I think we may see smaller states. I truly do. I think we're going to see Scotland and England, and it's not a given that all the United States stays the United States either.
Wonderful, thank you. I have two questions now. One from the chat, from Professor Matthias Lutz-Bachmann, the director of the Forschungskolleg Humanwissenschaften, a philosophy professor here at the college. You have not had a chance, Professor Slaughter, to listen to his introductory words. He's asking in the chat, how can we politically organize the international public in a way which is not depending on the state governments again? And maybe I can just add also my colleague Johannes Voelz, who has been raising his hand, who is coordinating the Democratic Vistas research project with me. Johannes, please join our discussion here with your question.
Sure. So thank you very much, Professor Slaughter and Ambassador Dion for these very provocative statements and positions. And I have two questions, one for each of you, but they both come from a similar direction in that they take up basically the right-wing populist position in order to take it seriously. And in order to understand how best to grapple with it. And so, Professor Slaughter, regarding your statement, I would like to press you a little bit on this issue of output legitimacy. How exactly do you ensure that output legitimacy is actually perceived as legitimate? It seems to me that you cannot really ensure output legitimacy simply by pointing to the success in output. There needs to be something else, a narrative added to it, Otherwise, you open yourself up to claims of a deficit of democracy. The hub model that you use is you tie it to questions of openness, of open society, even of accountability, but it can be perceived as exactly the opposite, as a lack of accountability. So it seems to me that we need a good answer of how to ensure that this is perceived as actually legitimate. Output itself doesn't seem to be enough. Ambassador, my question to you would be, you have been stressing that in Western democracies, the universalist line of thinking has been gaining traction more and more, in the sense that we have become more and more sensible to violations of universalist norms in places like China. And I think that is absolutely accurate. But at the same time, the populist narrative starts from what could be called an ideology critical impetus, where the sense is that behind the universalism lurks interest, actually in a way that isn't so different, perhaps, from the way in which governments in China and Russia themselves operate. As you stated, there the claim is always what appears to be universalism is really an attempt at Westernization. So the populist narrative also points out that behind universalism actually stands very specific interest, and that interest hasn't served the people well enough. So does not have to be included in your picture that within Western democracies, there's actually also a strongly anti-universalist strand. So those are the two questions. Thank you very much.
Professor Slaughter, do you want to go first this time?
I was going to give Ambassador Dion the pleasure so I could have more time to think. These are good questions, but I will go. So on the first question, I mean, how can we politically organize the international public in a way that is not dependent on state government? As I said, I do not imagine a world where the sovereign state disappears. I am not saying forever, but by the end of the century, at least, it's proven remarkably robust, even as it has changed in many, many ways. What I do see is a much greater recognition of multiple identities. And that may be an American-informed view just because of the tremendous demographic change we are going through from a white majority country to a plurality country. The only way for us to get there is to have multiple identities, to be American and to be many other things. And I do think, interestingly, the rise of the virtual world does make that easier. In other words, I can be here. I don't happen to be in my hometown, but I could be, I'm in a small town. I can have an intensity of life and of contacts here and be part of many larger things. Obviously, I'm part of my workplace. I'm part of my region. I'm part of and ultimately my nation. And so I can imagine people, again, having much more intense local connections. That's in part why I said I think you can imagine states getting smaller. But even when states aren't smaller, the ability, and this is why I emphasize mayors so much, because mayors have a very direct connection to their constituents. They have to deliver, and they're easier to hold accountable, and they're more visible. And people feel more connected to them often than to their national government. And of course, you can have various provincial governments depending on if you're a federal state or not. So what I think I see more are concentric circles of identity, but each of those allowing some degree of political action, as opposed to political action on the world stage taking place only in Washington. And I will say very concretely, I would advise any student of mine today, if they had a choice between going to Washington and working at the State Department and being in, the deputy mayor of international affairs, for Los Angeles or New York or Chicago or St. Louis, I would tell them to go to the city. I would say you're gonna feel the texture of international affairs much more immediately, whether it's trade or the environment or even terrorism. To the very difficult questions that Johannes Voelz asks, so these are questions we've been asking in the EU forever, right? When we think about the democracy deficit and whether or not the answer is more actual democracy or better outcomes in various ways. I will start by saying I do not have answers to all those questions. I am keenly aware, having studied networks for almost 30 years, of the challenges of networks on the one hand and hubs, those networks being, shadowy and less accountable, but on the other hand, being more participatory. And I think you can make the value of the hubs that I'm talking about is those are sites of transparency. So if you just have everybody being connected, that's a problem. You can't see who's there. You can't see who's connected to whom. If you have a hub and you can you have a secretariat, you have a virtual identity, a physical identity, and you have a commitment to specific outcomes, it is easier in health because you can talk about vaccinating 1 billion children more easily than you can providing equity. But you can talk about clean water and and access to food. If you look at the specificity of the SDGs, and then you think about being able to attract different sources of capital, again, you think about engaging local politicians as well as national government ones, I think you can construct structures of greater transparency and accountability in ways that will accompany output legitimacy. But I think those are the right questions to be asking. But I'm also very aware that if we do go this way, those are exactly the things we're going to have to work hard on. I just say that from my country, the United Nations writ large as an entity does not have that legitimacy. And it's not just because we're America. It's because you cannot see how that organization is actually contributing to your daily life. Whereas I think you could when it was preventing interstate war for much of the, with nuclear weapons, of course, but you could make a case for it much more strongly in the 50s, 60s, 70s, even 80s.
Ambassador Dion.
Well, you gave me, Gunther, 10 minutes. So in 10 minutes, I focus on one topic. And you gave me the topic multilateralism that I define as a cooperation among states in accordance with international standards. There are many, many other topics, and populism is certainly one. And I'm not saying it's not interfering in the way we debate within a democracy like Germany, the issue of multilateralism. Of course it does. But I focus on that, on the increasing difficulty to adjust two conceptions of multilateralism. One that said, okay, you want accordance, you want a cooperation among states. This cooperation will be easier to get if you don't interfere in their domestic affairs. That's a conception. And they will not interfere in own affairs. And then we'll go ahead on issues as key as to make sure that the next pandemic will be better addressed, for example, concrete issues like that. So don't interfere in their business and we'll cooperate better with them. And there are the others that are saying it's not acceptable if they are oppressing their population this way, polluting their environment this way within their own country. How can we do business with them? And that is not possible anymore. So you have these two trends, and they are exacerbating at a time where the tools we have to promote democracy in the world becomes more questionable. For example, the military intervention, well, most of the time it failed. It failed Iraq, Libya. Now we are out of Afghanistan after billions of dollars invested there. So this one is not very popular today. The other one, which is sanctions, seems to be the only tool we have in town now. Sanctions on sanctions on sanctions. And it's very questionable, the effectiveness of these tools. So we need to look at other tools, and I suggested regulations, maybe one of them, and Professor Slaughter is saying we need to invest more in the ability of non-etatic actors to be active on this file. About populism is another topic, but obviously it's a big one. I wrote on it a lot since I am the special envoy in Europe, because it's a big issue within Europe, a big issue in North America as well. In Europe, you have two trends: the extreme left one, that is saying the system does not work because the rich, the 1%, the 0.1%, is benefiting at the expense of the people, and we will speak for the people against this corrupt elite. But this leftist approach of populism is not very strong today. The one that is strong is the far right one. And this one is linked to identity. It's identity politics. It's about the fact that the white Christians are aging and concerned about their status, and they want a wall, different kind of walls. And if a politician is telling them, we will build to you a wall, especially when there is a wave of migration coming, then the support is going up everywhere in Europe. And this is a big, big problem. And I would be very pleased to address it if it was a topic.
Thank you very much.
It's influencing the way we work on multilateralism, when, as Professor Slaughter said, our governments are so much focusing on domestic problems in order to keep our democracies safe and healthy.
Now, in terms of our time frame, we are approaching the uppermost limit that we had set for ourselves. We have two questions left in the room, and I just want to ask both of you, Professor Malredi and Professor Jan, to perhaps just try to be brief so that we can have both Professor Slaughter and Ambassador Dion respond to your questions. I think I saw Professor Malredi first and then Professor Jan. Pavan, would you want to go first?
Yeah. Thank you, Ambassador Dion, and thank you, Professor Marie Slaughter. My question is again about universalism, and also what Ambassador Dion in the beginning made a comment about how to work with authoritarian regimes, and especially in the context of multilateralism. My concern is that sometimes in the context of global South, who is a democratic leader, who is a dictator, is often very difficult to tell. You know, what today you support a democratic leader, tomorrow you're basically financing a budding dictator. I mean, Aung San Suu Kyi was the darling of the West, right? Until she started complying with the killings of Rohingya people, right? She was a darling of democracy in Asia. And General Jacob Govan, who was the leader of the Biafra War, was actively supported by the British government, when in fact the secessionists were also wanting their own kind of democracy. Same thing could be said about Robert Mugabe. He was, in his early days, was seen as a figure of reconciliation in the same breadth of Nelson Mandela. But how things turned out to be. What I mean is that, you know, what is the ethical parameters of long-term, sustainable multilateralism? Looking outside of these short-term windows, how can we ensure that the support that is given, multilateralism that is extended today, does not yield into dictatorship and in fact ruin these countries?
And finally, Professor Jan, please.
The term multilateralism refers to a system of states, and Ambassador Dion, you spoke a lot about states like Germany and Canada, but why do you not mention the intermediate level of international organizations? We have not only to deal with civil society and states, but also the fact that universalist multilateralism is combined with the idea of a closer international cooperation that enables institutions like the European Union or NATO. And if NATO and EU were the answer to the challenge of the Soviet Union, and if you see nowadays that the Chinese challenge is much more important than the Russian one, wouldn't be in the logic that universalist multilateralism would be combined with the idea of a closer cooperation and institutionalization of the relations between the democracies of all the world. That means extension of NATO to a democratic alliance, a global democratic alliance, including Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and potential other Asian democracy. Wouldn't that be the answer? Not only on the civil society level to discuss the challenge of authoritarianism, but also on the level of how to organize the international system. And that, in my view, would include more stressing the intermediate level of international relations. That means international organizations.
Thank you very much. We go for a final round in this context before we pause and reconvene in a smaller private setting. Ambassador Dion, would you want to go first this time?
Yes, I think the two interventions have a link together. It's the idea that there is a danger to be purist about democracy. For an example is LGBT rights. I voted against that for a marriage only between a man and a woman because I have been whipped by my party since 1999. The Minister of Justice of a Liberal Party said to its MPs, this is a marriage between a man and a woman, and if we want to win the next elections, it's the way it is. A year after, the Supreme Court of Canada said, no, it's against the Charter of Rights, and gay people have the right to be married. And all of a sudden, we became champion of gay marriage. I was pleased by that. It was my personal view. Was not happy to be whipped the other way. But just to tell you, it's not middle age. It's yesterday that democracies like us had difficulties with this kind of rights. And then we go in Africa and we say, if you don't have the same view than us, you are not really Democrats and so on. I think there is a danger to be purist with the universalist approach of human rights. I understand that. I would like all these rights to be respected around the world tomorrow. But the best way to promote them, it may be also to understand that between the, as Professor Mulready said, between perfect democracy and autocracy, there is a gray zone. There is a lot of authoritarian democracies. And if we don't work with them, if President Biden was going ahead with his idea to have a meeting between democracies, and he was only inviting the well-established ones, he would bring the other ones closer to China instead of to be with us. So purism is a danger, I agree with that. It's inherent to our aspiration of universal rights, but at the same time, a bit of geopolitics, of realism is important. And the idea I mentioned and what Minister of Foreign Affairs Garneau is asking me to do about Armenia, I think is very important to identify the courageous governments around the world which are trying to do their best in awful circumstances with a lot of corruption and things that are unacceptable, but at least they are trying to improve their countries. We should be there to support them, because if we don't do so, the next ones will be the autocrats.
Professor Slaughter.
So I think I agree. And indeed, these two questions are related and they kind of answer one another. I am very much, I'm very sympathetic with Pavan Mulready's view that it's the label democracy or non-democracy is just not nuanced enough. I say this from speaking in a country that is manifestly less free by Freedom House's rankings than it was 10 years ago. And we are still a relatively, we hope, secure democracy, but when you look at newer democracies, it is very hard to tell, and some older ones as well. Look at the European Union's experience with Hungary and Poland and other countries. So for part of what I'm arguing when I argue for disaggregation is to say that instead of insisting on the label democracy or not, and once again, Joe Biden came in, he said, we're going to have a summit of the democracies. And very quickly, they started looking around, trying to figure out whom to invite and whom not to invite. And they ran into a very tough question. And they weren't going as far as Myanmar to have to answer that question. So, which is why I want to focus on the characteristics of a democracy, of an open society, of an open government, of an accountable government, a transparent government, of a participatory politics, and I mean a real participatory politics, not fake. Those qualities, although not easy to measure, I think tell you more and allow you to be much more specific than simply talking about the democracies or not. The other point, though, just to Professor John's point, multilateralism means multi-sided. It means multiple participation. We say that means states because that's the way the international system was set up in Westphalia, but the institutions you're talking about were set up in the 20th century. I really do see a different generation, far more multiracial, far more, just a very different generation than my own in the United States, who just don't respond to the vision of interstate war as the dominant global problem and interstate institutions as the primary sources of solutions.
Well, thank you very much to both of you, Professor Slaughter and Ambassador Dion, and all the participants who were just engaging in this discussion. This is a big topic, obviously, and a lot of issues that are not easily answerable in either or fashion. I'm very grateful that all of you joined. Thank you very much to the public who is participating in this event. There will be a video online, I think, starting tomorrow. Thank you for participating, and all the best to continue in whatever context with that kind of debate. Thanks, and see you soon or later. Bye-bye now.